The hospital door slid open with a sharp sound that echoed down the hallway. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, strong enough to make anyone uneasy. Nurses moved quickly, their shoes tapping against the polished floor, voices low but urgent. Everything felt rushed, tense, and uncertain. On a stretcher, a man lay still, his face pale, his breathing uneven. Machines beeped softly beside him as he was pushed deeper into the emergency ward. A small crowd had gathered for a moment, then slowly disappeared, as people often do when something doesn't belong to their own lives. A few steps behind the stretcher stood his wife. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shouting or asking questions. She just stood there, her arms crossed tightly, her face calm in a way that didn't match the situation. Her eyes followed the stretcher as it turned the corner and disappeared behind double doors. For a brief moment, it looked like she might step forward, but she didn't. Instead, she stopped walking. A nurse approached her gently, asking if she was family. She nodded once. "They're taking him in for tests," the nurse said. "You can wait here. A doctor will speak with you soon." She nodded again, still silent. The nurse gave her a sympathetic look before rushing away. The waiting area was quiet except for the occasional cough or the distant hum of machines. She sat down slowly, her hands resting in her lap. She stared at the floor for a long time, as if trying to focus on something simple, something that didn't hurt. But her mind wouldn't stay quiet. It pulled her back to mornings that began in silence, back to nights that ended the same way, back to conversations that never really happened. Their marriage had not fallen apart in a single moment. It had happened slowly, over years, like something fading rather than breaking. He had not been a bad man. That was what made it harder. He had been kind in his own way, but distant, present, but not really there. He depended on her for everything, decisions, responsibilities, even emotions. At first, she didn't mind. She believed that was what love looked like. Supporting, caring, holding things together. But over time, it became heavy. Every bill, every problem, every plan, it all came to her. If something went wrong, she fixed it. If something needed to be decided, she decided. If something needed to be held together, she held it. And slowly, without noticing, she began to disappear inside that role. There were nights she wanted to talk, really talk, about how tired she felt. But he would brush it off, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. He always believed things would be fine. "Don't worry," he would say. "It'll work out." But it didn't feel like it was working out. It felt like she was carrying a life that belonged to both of them. And he didn't see it. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the problems, not the stress, but the feeling of being invisible while doing everything. Back in the hospital, she shifted slightly in her chair. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than it should. After what felt like hours, a doctor finally walked toward her. He looked serious, but calm. "Are you his wife?" he asked. She nodded. "He's in a critical condition," the doctor said carefully. "We're doing everything we can, but the next few hours are very important." She listened without reacting. The words settled around her, but they didn't seem to reach her fully. Critical condition. Important hours. Everything we can. She had heard phrases like that before, just in different forms. Not in hospitals, but in life. Warnings, concerns, things that needed attention. And every time, she had been the one to respond. The one to fix. The one to hold things together. But now, sitting there, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. She felt empty. Not sad. Not angry. Just empty. The doctor continued speaking, explaining procedures, possibilities, risks. She nodded occasionally, but her mind had already drifted somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere far away from all of this. When the doctor finished, he gave her a reassuring nod and walked away. She remained seated. Minutes passed, then more minutes. People came and went. A child cried somewhere down the hall. A phone rang. Footsteps echoed. Life continued around her, but inside her, something had stopped. She thought about the years behind her, all the small moments she had ignored, all the times she told herself things would get better. All the time she chose to stay quiet instead of speaking up. She thought about the person she used to be before everything became about responsibility. Before every day felt like something to survive rather than live. A deep breath escaped her, slow and unsteady. For the first time in a long time, she asked herself a question she had been avoiding. What about me? The question felt unfamiliar, almost wrong, but it stayed. She stood up slowly. Her legs felt steady, even though her thoughts weren't. She looked toward the hallway where they had taken him. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not panic, not fear, something softer, something human, but it passed quickly. She turned away. Step by step, she walked toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one noticed. To everyone else, she was just another person moving through the hospital. Another face in a place full of stories. The doors opened again with the same sharp sound as before. Cool air brushed against her face as she stepped outside. The noise of the street replaced the silence of the hospital. Cars passed. People talked. Life moved forward like nothing had happened. She stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Then she began to walk. No destination. No plan. Just walking. Behind her, inside the hospital, machines continued to beep. Doctors continued to work. Nurses continued to move quickly through the halls. And in one room, a man lay unconscious, fighting for his life. He didn't know she had left. He didn't know the chair beside his bed would remain empty. He didn't know that when he opened his eyes, the first question on his lips would have no answer. Hours later, the hospital room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of machines. His fingers twitched slightly. His breathing shifted. A nurse noticed and quickly called for the doctor. Moments later, his eyes slowly opened. Everything was blurry at first. Lights, shadows, shapes. He blinked, trying to focus. The world came back in pieces. Confusion settled in. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak. The doctor leaned closer, speaking calmly, telling him he was safe. But he barely heard him. His eyes moved around the room, searching, looking for something, looking for someone. Finally, in a faint voice, he asked the only thing that mattered to him in that moment. Where is she? The room fell silent. The nurse glanced at the doctor. The doctor hesitated for just a second because there was no simple answer. Outside, far from the hospital, she kept walking. Each step took her further away from the life she had known, further away from the man who had once been her world, and closer to something unknown, something uncertain. But for the first time in years, something that felt like her own. The man woke up to the soft beep of a heart monitor and the sterile smell of the hospital room. The light above him was harsh, making his head throb a little more. He blinked several times, tried to adjust, but the first question that crossed his mind was not about the pain or the machines. It was about her, the woman who had been beside him through so much, who had always been his anchor in small and silent ways. Where was she? The nurse noticed his confusion and hesitation. "You're awake," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "Do you remember what happened?" He tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. Where is she?" The nurse's eyes softened, but she didn't have the answer he wanted. She's not here," she said carefully. "She hasn't been seen since the accident." His chest tightened. The words didn't make sense at first. How could she not be here? She had always been there. Always. Even in moments when he felt like giving up, she had been there. And now she was gone. Days passed in a blur. The hospital became a strange, silent prison where he learned to move his body again, to eat, to breathe in a rhythm that was almost normal. Friends and distant family came and went, offering smiles that didn't reach their eyes and words that felt heavy with awkwardness. They tried to fill the empty space she had left behind, but nothing could. He realized, slowly and painfully, that he had been abandoned, not by strangers, not by life itself, by the person he had trusted the most, the person he had believed would never leave. He hated her at first. The anger burned inside him, hot and sharp. How could she walk away? How could she leave when he needed her more than ever? How could she erase years of shared memories, of struggles fought side by side, and simply disappear? But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, anger shifted into something else. A strange, quiet determination. He had been forced to survive before. He had been forced to rely on himself in small ways every day. And now, he had no choice but to rebuild his life completely. He started with the basics. His body needed strength. His mind needed focus. Every day, he pushed himself a little harder. He learned to dress himself. He learned to eat without assistance. He learned to walk with steadier steps. Pain was constant, but it became a companion rather than a chain. Alongside the physical recovery, there was the emotional one. The nights were the hardest. Silence screamed in his ears. He imagined her face, remembered the way she would laugh at something small, or frown when things didn't go her way. He imagined her voice, sometimes kind, sometimes tired, sometimes frustrated. And with each memory, the absence became heavier. But slowly, he started to let go of the bitterness. Not completely, but just enough to breathe again. He realized that holding on to anger was like carrying a weight that served no one. He didn't need to forgive her yet. He didn't even have to understand. He just needed to keep living. He found a small apartment in the city, modest and quiet. The walls were bare at first, the floors echoing with emptiness. But he filled it with little things. Books he had always wanted to read, tools he had never learned to use, music that reminded him of better times. Each small victory became a building block of his independence. Work came next. It wasn't easy. The world had moved on while he was recovering, and he had missed opportunities, forgotten skills, and lost connections. But he took odd jobs, small tasks that no one else wanted, slowly learning how to navigate the world alone. Each paycheck, no matter how small, felt like a triumph. It was his proof that he could survive without her, without anyone's help. Friends who had drifted away began to return, but cautiously. They saw a man change, no longer the same dependent person she had known. He was stronger, quieter, and more self-contained. He didn't speak much of her, not even when asked. Talking about her was like reopening a wound that had finally begun to heal. Despite his growing independence, loneliness remained. Some nights, it pressed down like a heavy blanket, and he allowed himself to feel it fully. He remembered the way she had smiled at him after a long day, the warmth of her hand in his, the comfort of her presence that had once made even the darkest days bearable. And in those moments, he allowed himself to grieve, not just for her leaving, but for the life they had lost together. Time passed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the man changed. He learned to enjoy small things again. Walking in the park, feeling sunlight on his face, cooking a meal just for himself. He found joy in his independence, pride in the fact that he had survived, even when the world seemed to be against him. He was no longer the person she had left behind, fragile and dependent. He was someone new. Yet, despite everything, a part of him remained tethered to past. He thought about her often, wondering where she was, what she was doing, and whether she ever thought of him. He imagined her life, guessing at her struggles, her triumphs, her loneliness. Sometimes, he hoped she had found peace. Other times, he wished she had returned, if only to explain, if only to acknowledge the years she had abandoned him. But hope and expectation were dangerous. They could crush him. So, he kept moving forward, step by step, learning how to live in the space she had left behind. One day, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside, a few sentences in familiar handwriting. She had not forgotten him. She wrote. She had needed to leave. She was sorry. That was all. No explanations. No promises. Just a few words that stirred something he hadn't expected. Confusion, anger, sadness, and, strangely, a flicker of relief. She was alive. That was something. He didn't reply. He didn't know if he could. He wasn't ready to face her words or her presence. But he kept the letter, tucked away in a drawer where it reminded him of the past without controlling the present. Over time, he built a life that she could no longer touch. He made friends who were steadfast, people who valued him for who he had become rather than who he had been. He found hobbies and passions that reminded him that the world was bigger than the pain of abandonment. He even laughed sometimes, small, quiet laughs that surprised him with their warmth. And yet, every once in a while, a shadow of her presence would appear. In a shop, He would see someone with the same stride. On the street, someone's laughter would echo like hers. And in those moments, he remembered the man who had once depended entirely on her. He remembered the fear, the hopelessness, the feeling that life could not continue without her. But he had survived. He had grown. He had become someone stronger than the man she had left behind. And he knew that whatever happened next, he could face it on his own terms. 7 years passed in quiet determination. 7 years of learning, surviving, and rebuilding. 7 years that transformed him from someone fragile and dependent into someone steady, confident, and self-reliant. He had become a man who could walk alone, who could face the world without leaning on anyone, and who could find his own happiness even in the shadow of the life he had lost. And yet, the thought of her never fully disappeared. Sometimes, he wondered if she thought of him, if she regretted leaving, if she realized how much he had changed. But he didn't wait for answers. He kept living, keeping his heart open but cautious, his mind sharp, and his spirit resilient, because he had learned something essential in those years. Life would not wait for anyone. Not for the hurt, not for the lonely, not for the ones who had been abandoned. The world moved forward, and so must those who wish to survive within it. And in the quiet moments, when he allowed himself to remember, he felt a strange sense of pride. He had survived what seemed impossible. He had rebuilt a life from fragments. He had taken the pain of being left behind and turned it into strength, patience, and self-reliance. He was no longer the man she had abandoned. He was someone new, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever life might bring next, even if it included seeing her again, because somewhere deep down he knew their paths might cross. And when they did, he would no longer be the one left behind. He would be the one standing strong, steady, and unbroken. She walked the quiet streets, her coat wrapped tightly around her as the evening air brushed against her face. The city had changed, as had she. The lights reflected off the wet pavement, giving the streets a soft glow, but she barely noticed. Her mind was somewhere else, somewhere far from here, tracing back 7 years to the night she had left. It had not been an easy decision. She had wanted to stay, to hold on, to fight through the suffocating weight of the marriage. But every time she thought about the years behind her, she felt that weight pressing down harder. Every argument, every silent night, every time she had swallowed her own pain to manage his, all of it had built up until she could no longer breathe. That night in the hospital smell mixing with the harshness of fluorescent lights, she had felt something snap inside her. Leaving him had felt impossible, but staying had felt like losing herself completely. She remembered the way she had looked at him on the stretcher, the machines beeping around him, the concern in her heart fighting with the exhaustion in her body. She had loved him in her own way, but love had a limit, and she had reached hers. After she left, life was not kind. It had not been filled with immediate freedom or relief. The first few days were terrifying, full of uncertainty and fear. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and the weight of guilt pressed heavily on her. Every step away from the hospital felt like she was walking through a storm of shame and regret. She had to start over completely. Simple things became challenges. Renting a small apartment, paying bills, finding a job that could keep her afloat. Each task felt monumental. At night, she often lay awake, haunted by his face, the way his eyes had searched for her in confusion, the helpless voice that had asked where she was. It echoed in her mind constantly. She survived by creating structure. Every day had rules, even if small. She woke up early, went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, cleaned the small apartment. She found temporary comfort in routine. She met people cautiously, never letting anyone too close, never revealing too much. Trust was something she had lost along with her old life. But life has a way of pushing forward, whether we are ready or not. Slowly, she began to rebuild herself. Not as a wife, not as someone living in the shadow of another, but as herself. She took classes she had wanted to take years ago, but had never had time for. She started painting again, losing herself in colors and strokes, each brushstroke a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of creating something beautiful. Work became a source of quiet satisfaction. She found a job that required skill and attention, a place where she could feel competent and needed, but not overwhelmed by someone else's demands. Her colleagues were polite but distant, which suited her perfectly. She kept her past carefully locked away, a private story that belonged only to her. Even as she found independence, she could not escape guilt. Nights were hardest. She often thought about him lying in that hospital bed, alone, waiting, wondering where she had gone. Sometimes, she imagined how broken he must have felt, how uncertain his life must have become without her. She wished she could tell him that leaving had not been about hatred or lack of care. It had been about survival, hers, mostly. She had needed to breathe again, to find herself outside the suffocating bonds of the life they had shared. Time passed slowly at first, then quickly. Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years. Each year brought new challenges and small victories. She moved apartments once, then again, each time choosing a place where she could feel safer, more herself. She traveled when she could, experiencing things she had postponed for years. The world outside her old life became her teacher, showing her strength, resilience, and the quiet joy of being her own person. Friends, distant and newly made, became her anchors. She trusted slowly, cautiously, testing people in small ways. Some stayed, some left. But each interaction reminded her that life could be softer, kinder, and more forgiving than her past had been. She found herself laughing again, quietly at first, then louder, more freely. The sound of her own joy was a new melody in her ears, one she had almost forgotten. And yet, even as she thrived, he lingered in her thoughts. She never sought him out. The thought terrified her. What would she say if she saw him again? Would he hate her? Would he forgive her? Could she forgive herself? These questions were like shadows, following her steps, sometimes faint, sometimes overwhelming. She reminded herself daily that she had no answers, that the past was something she had to live with, not something she could erase. Her focus remained on building the life she wanted, learning the boundaries she had neglected, and finding peace in her own company. She was stronger than she had ever been, not because the world had been easy, but because she had chosen to survive it alone. 7 years had changed everything. She was no longer the woman who had left in despair, trembling and uncertain. She was independent, resilient, and self-aware. She had learned her limits, her worth, and the necessity of putting herself first at times. She had learned that love without respect for oneself can become a prison, no matter how deep the affection may be. And still sometimes her heart ached quietly. She remembered the life she had walked away from, the man she had loved, and the moments that would never return. But she also understood that the ache was proof of her humanity, proof that she had cared deeply, and that she had survived deeply. She now walked streets alone, but with purpose. Each step was steady, controlled. She had learned to trust herself, to rely on her own instincts and judgment. Her life had become a mosaic of small victories, of challenges met and overcome, of pain acknowledged but not allowed to dominate. Every day was a choice. She chose work. She chose friendships. She chose self-respect. She chose creativity. She chose independence. And in those choices, she found a quiet joy that no one could take from her. And yet, fate has a quiet way of reminding us of the past. She did not expect it. She did not seek it. But she would learn, in a way that would shake her to the core, that paths long abandoned can cross again, and the past she had left behind might one day meet the present she had fought so hard to build. For now, she walked forward, unaware of the moment that was quietly approaching. She carried her memories like fragile glass, beautiful, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Every step she took was deliberate, every breath measured, every thought a reminder that she had chosen herself, and that, for the first time in years, she could live freely in the life she had rebuilt with her own hands. And in the quiet of the city streets, under the glow of street lights and the soft hum of distant traffic, she felt it. The weight of the past had lessened, but its presence remained, whispering that life is never truly finished, that the stories we leave behind continue to move, and that one day, we may be forced to face what we once thought we had escaped. She did not know when that day would come. She did not know what it would feel like. But she knew one thing. She was no longer the person who had left. She was stronger, wiser, and capable of surviving whatever the world would throw her way, even if it meant confronting the life she had left behind. She had been walking through the city all afternoon, running errands, enjoying the quiet rhythm of her life that had grown familiar over the years. The streets were busy, people moving in every direction, but she felt a calm in the movement. Everything was predictable, safe, and under her control. She had built this life carefully, piece by piece, and for the first time in a long time, she felt steady. Then she saw him. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, someone moving past a shop window. Her heart did not immediately react. She assumed it was someone else, a stranger with the same height, the same posture, maybe even the same stride. But as she moved closer, her steps slowed. She tried to tell herself it was impossible. He was far away, gone from her life, perhaps even changed beyond recognition. But then their eyes met. Time seemed to stop. The city around them blurred, voices muffled, footsteps slowed. Her chest tightened, her breath caught. There he was, standing in the sunlight that filtered through the tall buildings, looking almost the same, yet unmistakably different. He had grown into himself in the years they had been apart. There was confidence in the way he held himself, a quiet strength in the curve of his shoulders. She froze. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the moment, but words refused to form. She could only stare, rooted to the spot, as he looked back at her with the same shock and recognition that mirrored her own. It was him. No doubt, no question. He was alive, stronger, changed, and yet he was the man she had left 7 years ago. For a long moment, neither moved. People passed around them, oblivious to the silent storm brewing in the space between two former lives. She could see it in his eyes, the memories, the hurt, the unspoken questions. He took a cautious step forward. She wanted to step back. Her heart screamed, telling her to run, but her legs would not obey. Every instinct, every memory, pulled her toward him and at the same time begged her to stay away. "Are you?" he began, his voice careful, low, almost afraid. "Is it really you?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "It's me." The world around them seemed to settle, the noise fading into the background. For the first time in years, they saw each other fully. Not the images stored in memory, not the fleeting thoughts and dreams, but the real, grown, changed versions of themselves. 7 years, he whispered, almost to himself. His eyes searched her face for answers she did not have ready to give. She wanted to explain everything, to pour out the years of fear, guilt, and survival into words he could understand. But the words tangled in her throat. How could she condense 7 years of living, learning, and growing into a few sentences? How could she make him see that leaving had not been cruelty, but necessity? He didn't speak for a while, just looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw pain, but also something else, something she hadn't expected. Curiosity, restraint, and a quiet control she had never noticed before. He was no longer the man she had left behind, trembling and dependent. He was steady, grounded, and in some ways untouchable. She realized, with sharp pang, that she had underestimated him. In her absence, he had grown into himself. He had survived without her, learned to live without leaning on anyone else, and become someone she barely recognized, but also someone she could not ignore. "Why?" he finally asked, the single word carrying the weight of years of unanswered questions. Not anger, not blame, just a raw, simple question that had haunted him for so long. She looked down, hesitating. She wanted to explain, but she knew explanations were fragile. They might not be enough, and they might open wounds that were better left closed. But she had to try, even if it was imperfect. I left because I couldn't stay, she said quietly, her eyes flicking to the ground. I was lost. I didn't know how to be myself while being everything for you. I thought maybe stepping away would help me find some strength, some clarity. He listened, his face unreadable, and for a moment, she feared she had only made things worse. But then he nodded slowly, absorbing her words, letting them settle like stones in a river. "I survived," he said finally, his voice calm, almost measured. "I had to. I had no choice but to keep going. And I did. I became someone I never thought I could be without you." Her heart tightened at his words. He had become strong, capable, independent. And yet, there was no bitterness in his voice, no cruelty, no mockery, just acknowledgement, a recognition of the life they had shared and the years they had lost. The silence stretched between them. She wanted to reach for him, to touch him, to see if he was real, but she held back. She realized that the past 7 years had created boundaries neither of them could easily cross. They had changed. Their lives had diverged in ways that could not simply be undone by meeting in the street. People passed around them, oblivious to the quiet reunion of lives once intertwined. She realized how small and insignificant the world seemed in comparison to the moment they were sharing. Nothing else mattered. No deadlines, no errands, no passing conversations. Just the presence of each other. Quiet and heavy with years of meaning. He stepped slightly closer, his eyes still searching hers. "I never forgot you," he said softly. "Not for a day." She felt a lump form in her throat. She had thought that leaving meant erasing herself from his life, forgetting, surviving alone. But she had been wrong. He had remembered her every day, and somehow, in his absence, she had remembered him too. "I didn't want to leave," she whispered, tears threatening but not falling. "I had no choice, not if I wanted to survive myself." He nodded again, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't expected, a trace of understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. Not a full forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition that life had forced them both to endure and to change. They stood there for a long time, two people who had once shared everything, now strangers in some ways, yet intimately familiar in others. The city moved around them, lights flickering, cars passing, voices calling, but all seemed distant. In that space, for that moment, the years fell away. Finally, he spoke again, softer this time. "I don't know if things could ever be the same, but I needed to see you. I needed to know that you're alive, that you're okay." Her eyes met his, and she nodded slowly. "I'm okay," she said. "I've learned to be okay." A quiet calm settled between them, fragile but real. They had not solved everything, had not erased the past or all the pain, but they had found each other again in a way that was honest and human. No illusions, no pretense, just recognition, truth, and the weight of all that had passed. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the moment shifted. The world reasserted itself. People passed more closely. A bus honked. The city breathed around them. Yet the encounter had changed something inside both of them. They had seen the other fully, and that vision would linger long after they parted ways. They didn't hug. They didn't hold hands. They didn't make promises. But in the brief exchange of glances, words, and understanding, they both knew something profound had happened. For her, it was a reminder of the life she had walked away from and the consequences of that choice. For him, it was a reminder of the strength he had gained and the resilience that had carried him through years of absence. They began to move apart slowly, cautiously, each step deliberate. Neither looked back immediately, but both carried the encounter in their minds, a quiet tension that would not fade easily. She realized something essential as she walked away. Seeing him had not broken her, nor had it undone the life she had rebuilt. Instead, it reminded her of who she had become, the strength she had discovered, and the clarity that leaving had given her. And he, standing for a moment longer, realized that seeing her had not made him weak or vulnerable. It had reinforced what he had learned over the years. Survival was possible, growth was possible, and life could continue even after profound loss. In the crowded city street, they had found each other again, not to reclaim the past, not to fix the unfixable, but to acknowledge the truth, that they had existed in each other's lives, that they had been loved and lost, and that the years apart had shaped them into who they were now. Neither knew what would come next. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps something unexpected. But in that brief encounter, the human heart had been laid bare and both of them felt it. The weight of years, the ache of absence, and the strange, fragile hope that life could still hold meaning even after such separation. They parted finally, each walking their own path, carrying the memory of the meeting like a fragile flame, fragile but real, lighting the way toward whatever lay ahead. They found themselves sitting across from each other in a small, quiet cafe a few days after the chance meeting on the street. Neither of them had spoken much since that encounter, but both had felt the pull of unfinished stories, the need to confront the years that had passed, and the unspoken questions that had lingered in silence for so long. The air was warm inside, filled with the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of cups. Outside, the city moved relentlessly. But here, time seemed slower, gentler, almost patient. She watched him across the table, noticing details she had never paid attention to before. The subtle lines around his eyes, the way he held his hands, the quiet strength in his posture. He was older now, yes, but older in a way that had brought wisdom, not weariness. "I wasn't sure you would ever agree to meet," he said softly, breaking the silence first. His voice had a calm certainty that made her chest tighten. "I didn't know if you want to face me." She looked down at her cup, swirling the coffee absent-mindedly. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. Part of me wanted to run the moment I saw you again. It's been so long, and yet it feels like yesterday too." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I spent so many years wondering why you left. I asked myself if I could have done something differently. I carried that question everywhere, even when I wasn't thinking about it directly." Her throat tightened. She had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even blame. But instead, there was calmness, a quiet acceptance that she hadn't imagined he could possess. "I didn't leave because I stopped caring," she said softly, almost a whisper. "I left because I didn't know how to survive while being everything for you. I felt lost. I needed to find myself again, even if it meant leaving you behind." He listened intently, eyes never leaving hers. "And you did find yourself?" he asked gently. "I think so," she said, hesitating. "It hasn't been easy. I've struggled, felt alone, and faced a lot of hard truths. But I've learned who I am without depending on anyone else entirely. I've learned my own strength." A faint smile touched his lips. "I can see that. You've changed, and yet you're still the same person I knew. The person I loved in some way, even when I didn't fully understand you." For a moment, the past felt suspended between them. Years of pain, absence, and unanswered questions condensed into a single fragile breath. She wanted to reach out, to explain more, but the words seemed insufficient. No explanation could undo the 7 years of absence. No confession could fully heal the hurt. "I carry the weight of leaving you," she admitted quietly, her voice shaking just slightly. "Every day, I wonder how you were, if you were okay, if you forgave me, even silently. I never wanted to hurt you, not truly." He reached across the table, hesitating just a moment before resting his hand lightly on hers. The gesture was simple, human, and filled with profound honesty. "I won't lie," he said softly. "It hurt, more than I can explain. I felt abandoned when I needed you the most. But I survived. I grew. I became someone I didn't think I could be without you. And maybe I can understand why you left now." Tears threatened to fall, but she held them back, blinking rapidly. The acknowledgement in his words was more than she had dared to hope for. He had not rejected her, not angrily, not bitterly. He had spoken the truth of his own survival, and in doing so, he had opened a door for both of them to see the truth clearly. They spoke for hours, slowly, carefully. They shared stories of the years apart. Not everything, but enough to see the ways their lives had been shaped by absence. He spoke of learning independence, of finding his own strength, of moments of quiet sorrow that reminded him of what had been lost. She spoke of the struggles she had faced, of learning to stand on her own, of the quiet triumphs and painful lessons she had endured. There were moments of silence, too. The kind of silence that carried more meaning than words ever could. They didn't rush to fill it. They didn't need to. Each pause was a recognition of the past, a space for reflection, a quiet acknowledgement that their lives had moved forward in separate directions. "I don't know what comes next," he said at one point, voice low but steady. "I don't know if we can ever be what we were. Maybe that time is gone forever." She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I don't know either, but I do know that we needed this conversation, this truth. I needed to tell you why I left. I needed to hear from you that you survived, that you are okay." He squeezed her hand gently. "I am okay. And you? Are you really okay?" "Yes," she said after a pause, her voice firmer now. "I'm okay. I've learned to stand alone, to trust myself, to live fully. I've grown into someone I can be proud of. A quiet calm settled over the table, as if the years of pain, separation, and uncertainty had finally found a fragile resolution. Neither of them would forget the past, nor would they ignore the impact it had on their lives. But in that moment, they understood each other fully, without judgment, without accusation. They didn't speak of reconciliation. They didn't make promises or plans. The point of this meeting was not to rekindle what was lost, but to recognize the truth. That both had survived, that both had grown, and that the past, while painful, had shaped them into who they were now. When they finally stood to leave, the cafe felt warmer, more alive. The city outside was bustling, the sounds louder, the movements faster, but inside, they carried a quiet, shared understanding. The years had not been erased, the pain had not vanished, but they had reached a point of emotional closure. Outside, they paused. The air was cool, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows. Neither knew if they would meet again. Neither made a move to promise that they would. They simply looked at each other, acknowledging what had been, what had changed, and what remained between them. "Take care of yourself," he said finally, his voice gentle. "You too," she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. And then, slowly, they walked away from each other, each returned to their separate lives. The moment was over, yet its impact lingered. Quiet, profound, and human, she walked with a sense of peace she had never expected to feel. She had faced her past, acknowledged it, and been acknowledged in return. She realized that leaving had been both a painful and necessary act, that had allowed them both to grow, to survive, to become the people they were meant to be. He walked in the opposite direction, feeling a weight lift from his chest. Seeing her, hearing her, understanding the truth. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave him clarity, closure, and a strange, gentle hope. He was no longer the man abandoned in a hospital bed, dependent and uncertain. He was a survivor, capable and independent, and he had faced the truth he had carried for so long. For both of them, the encounter was a turning point, not a reunion, not a rekindling of what had been, but a quiet acknowledgement that life, in its own way, had allowed them to meet again, not to reclaim the past, but to honor it and move forward. The years behind them were gone. The choices they had made, the paths they had walked, had shaped them, tested them, and ultimately strengthened them. They had loved, lost, and survived. And now, in this moment of fragile closure, they could finally carry those experiences without the heavy weight of regret. Life continued. They would continue, separate, yet connected by the shared truth of what had happened, of what they had endured, and of what they had survived. And as they disappeared into the bustling streets, each carrying their own life forward, both knew one thing with certainty. Sometimes leaving breaks a story, but sometimes it is the only way for both people to find who they were meant to become. The past had been painful, the present quiet, and the future uncertain. But for the first time in many years, both felt ready to face it fully and honestly, carrying the lessons of love, loss, and survival in their hearts.